Let's get started with our lesson on Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s, and again, more specifically, 1963. So, as you can see on the screen, we're not just going to talk about Mississippi at large. We're specifically talking about Jackson, Mississippi. And this is one of my favorite subjects of history to discuss. And as you can see in the image on the screen, Jackson, Mississippi in 1963 was very chaotic, to say the least. As you can see in the screen, the police is on the motorcycle in the background. You see individuals running. In fact, you see all of these individuals seem to be black, and they all are even dressed up in suits and a Sunday type of attire. So what is the story really signifying and telling us about Jackson, Mississippi in 1963? So I want to start off with this quote by activist Dara Cooper, who is a food justice activist, but we're using this quote in the context of our story. And that is, quote, "We don't need any more allies. We need accomplices in the fight for justice." Speaking of accomplices, there are two basic terms that we are really going to have to be familiar with in order to move through our lesson on today. And the first is accomplice. An accomplice is a person who knowingly helps another in a crime or wrongdoing. And in this case, the wrongdoing or the crime is, we will specifically be talking about the crimes that are committed, the unjust laws that therefore if you go against the law, then you are committing a crime, even if that law is helping other people or helping other people to reach a just and equitable end. So if you want an equitable society for all people during this period of time, that was unjust. And if you participated in helping to make for equal society when the law says you are not supposed to, then you will find yourself tagged or deemed an accomplice. So that's what we're meaning by accomplice in this context. Now, a villain, we all know what a villain is. A villain is a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. So this means a person, this is important, a person or a character is not evil by nature, but because their ideas or beliefs causes them to do evil things and do harm to other people. So no one is evil just because of the color of their skin or just because of them being born. They are evil. One becomes evil when you participate in having evil ideas and beliefs that causes harm to other people. So that's what we mean by that makes you a villain, and that's what we are using it for in this context. So keep those two definitions in mind, accomplice and villain. Now again, as I had stated earlier, to oversimplify the civil rights movement in Jackson, Mississippi, the movement centered on 6 things that we're going to discuss today: an oppressed people, an activist, a villain, an accomplice, a university, and a museum that tells the story. And the truth is, there were so many courageous individuals who stood up, who spoke out, who fought, and who died so that a better, more just nation could be born. This simplification for our lesson today is only a brief example of what so many individuals had to endure on a daily basis so that we can be where we are today. Let's go and engage in this activity, this lesson together. All right, I have a question for you already, right at the front of the presentation. An oppressed people is what this screen shows, because remember, that's the first thing we're going to talk about. An oppressed people. That's the first out of the 6 things we're going to discuss. And so an oppressed people, if you look at this image on the screen, it shows life in the South versus life in Mississippi. Can you tell me, what does this image tell us about life in Mississippi compared to life in the South? I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. What does this image suggest to us about life in Mississippi versus life in all of the U.S. Southland? Looking at this image, life in Mississippi was even harsher, more harsh than life in the South. Yes, life in the South, especially for certain groups of people, it was terrifying. It was horrific. It was harmful, abusive, deadly. It was unfair. It was unjust. And even despite all the atrocities of life in the South, life in Mississippi, especially in the 1960s, were that much more oppressive. You can see in the picture some of the things that are going on. You see people have flour dashed on their heads, pouring water on the people's heads. You see what looks like blood, or all kind of things oppression is happening and abuse is happening in this picture about life in Mississippi. But I say that life in Mississippi was more harsh than life in the South is because in the 1960s, despite the many murders and other criminal activity caused to black people or anybody who wished to see justice, there were no convictions of the murders and all of the crimes that happened in Mississippi. And if we know the story, anything about Mississippi as a whole, we know that in the 60s, a lot of death had taken place. We know the 3 civil rights workers were found buried under sand. We know what happened to Emmett Till, the 14-year-old, who was just visiting his family in Mississippi. And there are so many more told and untold stories that happened in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s, and yet there were no convictions of any of the crimes committed. That tells us that that was opposite of what was happening throughout the South. Life in the South, there were still lots of crimes, still lots of harm being done. There were convictions, there were investigations, there were change. The South saw change even in the 60s. However, life in Mississippi was brutal. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit about at least one of these stories as time permits. This image is, anybody know who any of the people in this picture, in this photo, who they are? This is an image of Mr. Medgar Evers, his 2 children, and his wife, Merle Evers. Medgar and Merle Evers, who lived in Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s. We're going to learn a little bit about their story. So, before I get to the question, let me back up and share a little bit about the Evers. The Evers, first of all, let's begin with Medgar. Medgar Evers graduated college. He was a veteran of the U.S. Army. He went to college where he met his lovely wife-to-be, Merle Evers. The 2 got married, and the 2 decided to move to Jackson, Mississippi, because Medgar Evers had decided to join the NAACP, this group of African Americans who were all about fighting for equality and doing what it takes to make this world a just world, specifically for black people. And as Mr. Evers joined this organization, one of his jobs were to go through Jackson, Mississippi, and to help lead and organize and create an organization that would help fight for justice for all people, specifically for black people in Jackson, Mississippi. But of course, in the 1960s, that was one of the most dangerous things one could do, to be an activist, to dare move to the South against the customs, against the Jim Crow laws of the South. The laws that said, of course, as you all know, that this restroom is for whites and this restroom is for colored. This water fountain is for whites and this water fountain is for colored. Oh, if you want to ride the bus, you can put your money as a black person on at the front of the bus, but then you have to step off the bus, go around to the back and get on the bus from the back of the bus. Oh, but sometimes, because people were so cruel, so mean, so evil, that sometimes black people would put their money on at the front of the bus, get off to go to the back of the bus, but before they could get on through the back, the bus driver would drive off. And so this was life in the South. Well, Medgar Evers said, okay, as part of my role in the NAACP, this organization to help black people, help life and society be more equitable for black people, I am going to stand up and I'm going to speak on the news and I'm going to speak out in the community and I'm going to get black people to do several things. I'm going to get them to vote. I'm going to teach them to read. I'm going to help them to be a part of this fight for justice. And I'm going to help empower African Americans to stand up with me and fight for our rights. We just want to be equal. Well, in that pursuit, Mr. Medgar Evers and his family moved to a community in Jackson, Mississippi, where it was all white neighbors. In his house, he was the only black person on that street. He and his family were. And of course, Mr. Medgar Evers, speaking boldly, proclaiming that everybody should be able to live in a just world. One night, after making an announcement on television, he drove home at night and pulled up inside of his driveway while his wife and the two children you see on the screen were watching television, waiting for their dad, Mrs. Evers, waiting for her husband to arrive. They heard his car pull up in the driveway. They were excited when, right after they heard the door shut, they heard a gunshot. And Mrs. Evers and the kids are doing what their dad and husband, Mr. Evers, had taught them. They all fell on the floor. And Mrs. Evers waited for a while, and then she went to the door where she saw her husband lying on the ground, shuffling his way to the front porch. And that's where all of the blood was stained, stained the driveway. And the neighbors helped, and reports say that Mr. Evers could have lived if he would have made it to the hospital. The only problem is that there were no hospitals nearby that would accept black patients. And so Mr. Evers died there at his home, right outside, before his wife and his two children. I have this question: which was Medgar Evers? Because we talk, there's an oppressed people, there's an activist, there's a villain, an accomplice. Which category or categories would you consider Mr. Medgar Evers to be in? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think. Is he A, a part of an oppressed group? B, an activist? C, a villain, or D, an accomplice? The answers, yep, there are two answers to it. Both A and B. He is a part of an oppressed group as an African American, especially in the South in the 1960s, but also an activist. As we discussed, he was an activist working for the NAACP, helping to empower people and fight for the rights of African Americans. So Mr. Medgar Evers would be part of an oppressed group and an activist. This is the home I described to you, and as you can see very briefly, I will point out a couple of things. Where is the front door? Oh, wait a minute. I see it. The front door is not at the very front of the house, but unlike all the other homes on this street, Mr. Evers, being the only black person in the neighborhood, had to get his home built a certain way in order to survive, for he and his family to survive. The front door is actually right here, located right along the side, right on the inside. And this was for the purpose of putting the front door here, was because if you had the front door right at the front of the house, of the home, he would be an easy target. Someone could easily gun him down or do more harm to him easily that way. But the plan was, with this architecture, Mr. Evers and his family would be able to pull into their driveway and go straight into the house without ever making it more difficult to bring harm to him if the door is right here along the side. So think about that the home had to be constructed in such a way that it could guarantee, or better guarantee, the survival of an entire family. Could you imagine? I could not imagine having to live with the continuous thought, the constant thought of, how am I going to protect my family in every type of situation, even when you go home? Now, as you can see, this window here at the front of the house, you could say, well, there's no front door, but there's a window. People could easily do some damage to the family through the window that's right there at the front. And the truth of the matter is, this window is at the front. I'm sorry. But if you look inside the window, look at the beds. What you might not be able to tell from this picture is that the beds are not sitting like most of our beds sit, on a bed frame with box springs and all of these things to make the bed sit high. In this picture, in the Evers' home, they did not use that. They rather only used a mattress, laid the mattress flat on the floor, and did not use a bed spring to make the bed sit high. Why might that be? Why would the children's bedroom have mattresses that lie directly on the floor? Well, that's because the window sat up high. And if any danger was to come their way, such as an assassin's bullet, it would not strike any of their children. Instead, their beds were so low that anything come through the window in that kind of way had a much greater chance of missing the children. Again, imagine the psychology of and all the thought process that goes into living in the South, especially in Mississippi in the 1960s, that even your children have to readjust the way they see life. Can you imagine as a child having to live with death in mind, with danger in mind? Now we're going to learn a little bit about Mr. Byron de la Beckwith. Okay. Now, Mr. Byron de la Beckwith, this is an older picture of him, but Mr. Beckwith, as you can see from this image, this is this is the assassin, the one who took the life of Medgar Evers in 1963. That was the year that Medgar Evers was murdered. And if we look at this picture, what are some things that we see in the background that tells us that are signs of danger? Oh, wait, let's look. This flag, anybody know what this flag represents? What does this flag mean? It is called a Confederate flag. And it represents a belief of white superiority, of black inferiority, and not just black people, but mainly white superiority. And this is a villainous mindset to think that some people are beneath you or inferior because of the color of their skin, because they think differently than you, they believe differently than you. If anybody think that way, those thoughts, those beliefs makes that individual a villain, not because of who they are, simply, I'll put it in simple terms, they are a villain simply because their ideas and beliefs are such that they bring harm to others, that it despises others. And Mr. Byron De La Beckwith had a belief, a philosophy that white people are superior. They are the best of the best. That you have to be white, you have to be heterosexual, you have to be Christian. That Jews and all these other religious beliefs were beneath him, were all wrong, and the way he thought was the only right way. So, because of that, Mr. Byron De La Beckwith, hearing about the life of Medgar Evers and reading that a black man lives in a white neighborhood, that a black man is rallying up people to be empowered, to fight for equality? No, we're not equal, says Mr. Byron De La Beckwith. And because of this man must be stopped, and I'm going to be the one to do it. And Mr. Byron De La Beckwith hid himself right across the street from Mr. Medgar Evers' home in the woods, which was a wooded area at the time, and he waited there for Mr. Evers to pull up in the driveway before he decided to take his life. So, with that being said, which was Byron De La Beckwith? Would you consider him a part of the oppressed group, an activist, a villain, or an accomplice? I give you a few seconds. I'm sure most of you got it right. Dun-dun-dun. A villain. Again, he's a villain. Just to reinstate this, a villain is a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. And this means that a person, Byron De La Beckwith, is evil not by nature, but because his ideas, his beliefs brought harm, brought danger to someone else. In this case, to the Evers' family, and it also sent a message to other African Americans that said that if you think about being equal, you better think again. To tell you one more thing about Mr. Byron De La Beckwith, he finally was arrested. In the 1960s, he was not found guilty of the murder, and his Mrs. Evers, Medgar Evers' wife, would fight tooth and nail, as they say, to make sure Mr. De La Beckwith was finally convicted, and he was tried 3 times. And in the early 90s, he was finally convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers. And Mr. Evers, Mr. Daley Beckwith, died in prison. Now, we talked about an oppressed people. We talked about an activist. We talked about a villain. Let's see which category does Joan Trump Power Mulholland fits in. Joan Trump Power Mulholland. And I recognize I missed the N on that. Mulholland. Joan Trump Power Mulholland. See, even teachers make mistakes sometimes. But before we get into it, look at this. Anybody recognize what this is called? Yeah, that's right. It's called a mugshot. It's a photo that you take, to be honest, when you're arrested. So we know from this image that Mrs. Trump Power Mulholland is a white woman, and she was arrested. And if we look to this picture on the right, on my right, Mrs. Mulholland is here in the middle, and right next to her, anybody know who this person is? That's right, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, why would the two be together? Okay, I'll tell you. Mrs. Trump Power Mulholland was the first white person to integrate, are you ready for this? A HBCU. That is a historically black college and university. Tougaloo College is what the name is in Jackson, Mississippi, is a historically black college. That means that it's a college, a university attended, especially at this time, by all black people. But Mrs. Joan Trump Power Mulholland was the first white person to ever be accepted into this university. And before going to this HBCU, she was a student at Duke University. And because she was such an activist and believed in equality for all people, she decided to go against her mother's and her father's wishes and withdrew from Duke University. And a few years later, she applied, and was accepted into Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. A decision that her parents did not like. But Mrs. Trump Power Mulholland was certain that she was going to make her mark in the world by being on the right side of history. In fact, at Tougaloo College, which is located in Jackson, Mississippi, Mrs. Trump Power Mulholland became the first Delta, something like that. Delta is a sorority that's predominantly black sorority. Now, we know that Kamala Harris, who is now going to be the Vice President of the United States, Ms. Kamala Harris is also a part of a sorority, a black sorority called AKA. Well, the sister sorority, in addition to AKA, like that Mrs. Kamala Harris is in, is Delta. And guess what? Although it's a sorority mainly of black females, Miss Joan Trump Power Mulholland was the first white person who was a Delta, a part of this black sorority, the sorority, which is all female, at an HBCU, historically black college and university. So not only did she integrate a HBCU, but Mrs. Trump Power Mulholland also integrated a sorority, a black sorority. Now, this picture of her with Martin Luther King Jr. is a picture of Mrs. Mulholland escorting Dr. King to speak to the students at Tougaloo College. When he came to visit, she escorted him, walked him to the area where he would be speaking. And Miss Trump Power Mulholland, her activism did not stop with escorting Dr. King to his location. The reason why you see her in this picture, mugshot, should I say, is because she was arrested because she decided to sit in at a lunch counter and along with other black people to integrate lunch counters. And because of that, she was arrested and she was taken, just like everybody else. She was also taken to the penitentiary in Mississippi, where she was on death row. Can you imagine? A college student seeking to get an education, decides to fight for justice, decides that has this philosophy, this belief, unlike Byron De La Beckwith, Mrs. Trumpower's belief was that, no, everybody should be equal. Everybody should be treated fairly and justly. And I'm going to stand and fight for that. Well, because of that fight, that only took place by sitting at a lunch counter with black people, she was on death row in Mississippi. But thank goodness, after spending a time on death row in penitentiary in this prison, she finally was able to get out. The judge finally allowed her to be free, and the others as well. And so Joan Trumpower Mulholland made a name for herself by standing up for justice. Let me ask you this question. Which would Joan Mulholland be a part of? Would you consider her an oppressed group, an activist, a villain, or an accomplice? Give you a few seconds. She is an accomplice. Woo! An accomplice, meaning that she was considered a person who did wrong, but she was on the right side of justice. So anybody, you and I both, anybody can be an accomplice to something that bring about equity or equality for all people. This is a picture of Tougaloo College, where it all went down, if you will, where Joan Trumpower Mulholland went. And as you see, it was a gated community. So that was protected a lot of students. That's one reason why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. could be somewhat safe when he went to Mississippi to speak at this college, because they could not let anybody in and out. I'll repeat, Joan Trumpower Mulholland is an accomplice, but the reason why is because that is a person who knowingly helps another in doing a crime or wrongdoing. That wrongdoing is, in this case, was when the law said that it's illegal for you to fight for someone else's rights. We've come a long way since then, even though we still have a long ways to go. So we talked about an oppressed people. We talked about an activist. We talked about a villain. We talked about an accomplice. Now we have to do two quick things, and I'm going to move this really fast because it's good news, really good news, amazing news. The Civil Rights Museum. A museum is a part of the story. This is a Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And inside this museum holds all of the stories one could ever learn. As many stories as you want to learn about Mississippi and throughout the civil rights movement is located here in Jackson, Mississippi. And so this is all of these are images on the wall, and as you can see, you see black people and white people. You see all kinds of people with different thoughts, different beliefs, different parts of the nation came together to fight for rights and equality for black people in the South. And these are all the heroes and sheroes who were arrested based on them being an accomplice, helping people to be seen as equal. So a museum is telling the history like museums do. What category will you be a part of? Will you be an activist? Speaking out, standing up for the rights of people? Will you be an accomplice? Though you may not be directly impacted by an injustice that is happening, you decide, I'm going to help these people get the equality and justice that they need and deserve. Will you be both? That's the question I present to you. Because in our world today, we certainly, at a time like this, need many more activists and many more accomplices. Thank you for being a part of this presentation on Jackson, Mississippi, 1963. I hope the information was very vital to you and something you can take with you. Thank you.